There were no tears, no sobs. Only the steady beeping of the heart monitor, slowing down like the final seconds being swept away by the wind outside the grand mansion nestled in a golden autumn forest. Inside the main bedroom, now transformed into a discreet private hospital suite, equipped with the most advanced medical equipment, Ethan Whitmore, one of the most powerful men in America, lay silently facing the one thing money could not control: death. The room was packed with siblings, nieces and nephews, and relatives all dressed in black with faces of grief and cold anticipation. Each gaze seemed to weigh Ethan's fate and the legacy he was about to leave behind. No one noticed the black woman quietly sitting in the corner of the room, strangely calm amid the tense atmosphere. She wore a simple dark green dress, and her soft curly hair was tied neatly. Her eyes never once left Ethan's increasingly pale face. Naomi Carter, 38 years old, no title, no voice. None of Ethan's relatives knew who she was. Only he did. For the first time in hours, the room finally fell silent when the doctor asked everyone to step outside for a consultation in the hallway. Naomi stood up. Her steps were gentle but resolute. She approached the bed, sat down on the edge of the mattress, held his cooling hand, and leaned down to whisper, "I'm here, Ethan, just like I promised." A faint movement fluttered at his eyelids. Then Ethan's green eyes slowly opened, clouded and sluggish. But still recognizing her, a faint smile, barely visible, flickered across his ashen face. "Naomi." He exhaled, his voice as thin as smoke. "You came, I promised. I always keep my word." Tears began to roll down her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. Ethan's hand lightly squeezed hers, weakly but stubbornly. 8 years, not enough. Ethan struggled to speak. "I should have told them. I should have made it public." Naomi leaned down, placed her other hand on his cheek, wiping away the upward trailing tear. "We had our reasons, Ethan. I don't regret a single day with you." The door swung open. A gray-haired man with a stern face entered. Brandon Whitmore, Ethan's eldest brother. Brandon froze when he saw Naomi holding his brother's hand. He frowned and demanded, "Who are you? Who allowed you in here? This is a family matter." Naomi didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her eyes remained fixed on Ethan, as if the rest were merely blurred shadows in the background. With the last breath left in him, Ethan turned his head toward his brother, struggling to raise his voice. "Brandon, this is Naomi. She's—" Naomi gently but firmly squeezed his hand, cutting in, "I'm an old friend." Brandon frowned, giving a curt nod. "Regardless, I'd like you to leave. The family needs privacy." He turned and walked away, unaware that in that very moment, his rejection had already lost all meaning. Naomi looked at Ethan, his eyes filled with pain, not because of the illness, but because he was still protecting others, instead of himself. "Even now, you still choose to protect them." "No," she whispered, touching his forehead. "I understand. You're protecting your peace." Ethan closed his eyes. A tear slid down his cheek. "The letter on my desk." He gasped. "My lawyer knows everything. They'll find out soon." Naomi leaned down and kissed his forehead. "I love you, Ethan. I always will." His breathing grew heavier. He squeezed her hand one last time. "Stay. Read the will. Face them. They need to see you. See? The truth." Naomi nodded, her tears no longer hidden. "I promise." And then everything went quiet. But Naomi knew this silence was the beginning of a storm yet to come. 7 years earlier, the Grand Astoria Hotel, downtown New York, where the powerful gathered not to celebrate, but to flaunt status with rehearsed smiles and empty promises. It was a charity event for a child welfare program supporting immigrant families. The host, Ethan Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Holdings, a man who had once graced the cover of Forbes, the kind of man whose mere presence in a room caused every camera to turn toward him instinctively. Naomi Carter stood on the opposite side of the ballroom, no cameras pointed at her, with a small name badge pinned to her chest that read Event Manager. Naomi Carter, she was directing her staff, as they realigned the buffet table, knocked askew by a drunken senator's clumsy hand. Her white shirt sleeves were rolled up. She wore no makeup or lipstick. A thin sheen of sweat glistened at her temple. She didn't glance at anyone with deference, didn't avert her eyes, didn't fawn. She worked, and worked with a sense of dignity that was hard to find amid an evening of pure pageantry. From the stage, Ethan glanced over and saw her for the first time. Not because she stood out, but because everyone else was performing. She was the only one who was real. Ethan left the stage after a senator's hollow speech and headed down a side hallway. There, Naomi was sitting against the wall, nibbling on a small cookie, her gaze distant as if she had wandered out of this world. Not many people dare to snack at the event they're running. His voice came from behind. Naomi startled. She turned and raised an eyebrow. Not many people wearing a $5,000 tuxedo walk over to talk to someone snacking. Both laughed softly, genuinely, no pretense. Ethan extended his hand. Ethan Whitmore. Naomi looked at his hand but didn't take it right away. She slowly stood up, brushed the cookie crumbs off her dress, and then shook it. Naomi Carter, the one behind all this mess. You did a great job, I know. Her reply made him pause. In a world where everyone tried to win his approval, she was the first who didn't need to. Ethan was silent for a moment, then asked, "You don't know who I am, do you?" "I do." "And you're not impressed?" Naomi shrugged, impressed by a rich man who gave a 3-minute speech on social responsibility and left before the scholarship segment began. Numbered Ethan burst out laughing, the kind of laugh he had never let out at events like these because it wasn't part of the script. "Do you always speak so directly, No?" "Only to those who need to hear it." That moment wasn't glamorous, it wasn't cinematic. But it was a turning point. Ethan returned to the VIP area, but his mind was no longer there. Naomi continued her work as if nothing had happened. But deep down, something had been stirred. That evening, Ethan sent a private email to the event company. Not to complain, but to ask, "I'd like to invite Mrs. Naomi Carter to dinner. No work talk, just dinner." Naomi took a week to reply. She had dated wealthy men before. She had been used, seen as exotic flavoring for white men trying to spice up their otherwise dull lives. But something in Ethan's eyes that night wasn't the same. She messaged back, "Just dinner, no proposals, no promises, no expectations." He replied, "Just a man who wants to meet again, the only woman bold enough to tell him not to put on a show in the middle of a political gala." And they met again, then again. Then they no longer needed to plan. Their love didn't begin with flowery words, no bouquets of red roses, no candlelit dinners, no "you're the only one I love." It began with a quiet nod. A glance was exchanged in the crowd. A simple dinner at a small Italian restaurant on Manhattan's West Side, where they both ordered the same dish and laughed when they realized it. Naomi didn't call it dating. She had been entangled in ambiguous relationships before. She was the only one who knew the truth. But Ethan was different, not because he was a billionaire, but because, when she was with him, she didn't have to be strong. She didn't have to wear the mask of independence. She didn't have to prove she was worthy. He didn't treat her like a strong black woman. He treated her simply as Naomi. They met every weekend, sometimes in his penthouse, sometimes in her small Brooklyn apartment. Ethan cooked clumsily. Naomi played jazz. Some nights they fell asleep on the couch with the TV on. No one needed to say "I love you" because it was all there in how he brushed her hair when she was tired and how she had his coffee ready on Monday mornings before work. One summer morning, when Naomi woke up from a fever and saw Ethan taking out the trash, doing dishes and flipping through her medical file, she murmured, "You're acting like we're married." Ethan turned around, silent for a moment. Then he said, "Why don't we be for real?" Naomi looked up, stunned. He wasn't joking. He sat down and pulled a small box from his shirt pocket. It contained not a glittering diamond, but a simple emerald ring with the word "still" engraved on the band. She asked, "What does still mean?" He replied, "Still in love, still scared, still here. But I still want to walk this road with you, even if I don't know how it ends." Naomi stayed silent for a long time, not because she was unsure, but it had been so long since someone dared to admit love and fear in the same breath. They got married in Antigua in a tiny chapel on a cliff. There were no guests except a local priest, an elderly couple who happened to visit, and the sound of waves crashing below. Naomi wore a white linen dress. Ethan didn't wear a tie. No music, no wedding cake, no press release. Just two vows. He promised not to walk away. She promised not to make him choose between love and family. But life isn't as simple as vows. After the honeymoon, Ethan returned to a world of boardrooms, stocks, and million-dollar galas. Naomi stayed in Brooklyn, continuing her work in event planning. They met secretly at rental apartments, fake business trips, and weekend retreats. Naomi didn't mind, at first. She understood Ethan's pressure. She knew his family especially. Brandon and Margaret would never accept a black woman raised without a father from a working-class neighborhood as the wife of America's golden son. Ethan promised, "Give me time, I'll figure it out." But time passed. 1 year, then 2, then 3. No introductions, no photos, no acknowledgement except hurried embraces behind closed doors. Naomi began to doubt. Not Ethan's love, but his courage. Love cannot live forever in the shadows, no matter how beautiful it is. Then one day, Naomi discovered she was pregnant. She realized it on a cold March morning. Not with a test, not with a calendar, but through instinct, standing on a Brooklyn street, suddenly placing a hand on her belly and feeling her heart skip a beat. She was on her way to a meeting for a spring event, but she couldn't remember a word of that meeting. All she could think about was Ethan's face. Imagine him smiling, touching her belly, whispering, "Our child." And then she imagined more and more until the tears came without warning. That night she didn't call Ethan. She needed to be sure. 3 days later, the test confirmed what she already knew. Naomi was pregnant 11 weeks. Ethan arrived the moment she texted, "I need to see you. It's something big." He stepped into the apartment, his eyes lighting up at the sight of her and dimming when he saw the ultrasound on the table. He said nothing for the first 10 seconds. Neither did she. Then he sat down and touched the scan. "This is real." Naomi nodded. Ethan exhaled like someone who'd lost his balance and just managed to stand. He got up, walked around the table, and hugged her from behind, his hands gently resting on her belly as a first hello to the tiny life inside. "We're going to have a child." Naomi turned to him, looking into his eyes, "And I don't want our child to grow up as a secret." There was no laughter, no denial, but also no promise. Ethan fell silent. His gaze drifted away. "I'm in the middle of negotiating a major merger. Whitmore Holdings and Orion Systems. Just a few more months. Things will settle. After that, I promise." Naomi cut in. "This isn't just about you and me anymore, Ethan. This is a human being. A child, and they deserve to be acknowledged from day one." Ethan squeezed her hand. "I know, and I want that. Just, please, a few more months." The months that followed, Naomi lived between two worlds. One was her small apartment, where she had prenatal checkups, yoga classes, parenting books, and morning whispers to her baby. The other was brief visits to a rented apartment, where Ethan brought vitamins, oatmeal, and a fetal Doppler. She wasn't alone, but she started to feel isolated. She had no one to call when her back ached at midnight. No pregnancy photos were posted. No baby shower. No one knew, and no one asked. When Aria was born, Ethan wasn't there. He was in Zurich meeting European shareholders to finalize post-merger strategies. Naomi gave birth alone in a small Brooklyn hospital room, signing the birth certificate and checking father unknown, even though in her heart she knew better than anyone who the father was. By the time Ethan returned, Arya was 3 days old. He held his daughter close, eyes red, whispering, "I'm sorry for missing your first cry. But I'm here now, baby girl, and I'm not going anywhere." Naomi stood by, hearing those words, feeling warmth and pain. She didn't need Ethan to be a sentimental father for a few minutes. She needed him to be the man brave enough to step into the light for both mother and child. But once again, that didn't happen. Months passed, then years. Ethan provided generously, visited often, took Arya for early morning walks or weekend outings. But every time Naomi brought up going public, he would say, "Not yet. Things are too sensitive right now." Naomi didn't demand a title, but she knew Arya deserved to know where she came from, and Ethan deserved a clear choice. When Arya turned 3, Naomi asked, "If you died tomorrow, what would our daughter be called out of wedlock, unrelated, or the child you never once acknowledged in front of anyone?" Ethan didn't respond right away. But that night, Naomi saw him sitting alone by the window, writing a long letter and placing it in the safe. That autumn, the leaves began to fall early. Naomi didn't know why, but she felt uneasy throughout September. Ethan called less frequently, and his visits with Arya became more sporadic. He blamed work, press conferences, and the pressures of the merger, but his voice over the phone sounded weaker. His eyes during video calls no longer held their light. Naomi asked, "Are you sick?" Ethan evaded the question. He smiled, trying to reassure her, "I'm just tired. Don't worry, once Q4 passes, everything will settle." She didn't believe him. Her instincts as a woman and a wife told her there was something he was hiding. One night at the end of October, Ethan called. "No warning, I want to see you, right now." Naomi felt a chill run down her spine. It was not because his voice was urgent, but because it was too gentle, like he had let go of something. They met at the old rented apartment, the hideaway they once shared. Ethan arrived late and walked in slowly. Naomi noticed his shirt hung looser than before, his cheeks had sunken, and his hands were thin and trembling. "How long?" she asked with no hesitation. Ethan sat down quietly. Then he said, "Diagnosed 3 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, late stage." Naomi froze. Her heart pounded so hard she couldn't hear anything beyond her breath. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want you to look at me like a dying man. You're Arya's father. You're my husband. We don't keep this from each other." Ethan lowered his head. She saw him struggling to hold back emotions like he always did, to maintain his strong image in the eyes of the world. But this time he failed. "Naomi, I've rewritten my will. Everything in my private estate that is not tied to the corporation will go to you and Arya. My lawyer has already signed it. I need more time to—" "What about your family?" she interrupted. Ethan looked up. "I don't know. I haven't told them. They don't know about you or Arya." "I was afraid." Naomi clenched her hands. "You were more afraid of them being angry than of us being left behind." It wasn't an accusation, it was just a question so painful it didn't need to be voiced harshly. Ethan froze, then softly said, "I was wrong. I was brave at the wrong times, and afraid at the worst ones." Naomi didn't cry. But inside her something cracked. Not her love, but the hope was that Ethan would still have time to right the things he hadn't yet dared to face. After that night, everything moved quickly. Ethan was hospitalized just 2 weeks later. The disease progressed mercilessly, faster than any doctor expected. The Whitmore family didn't understand why he declined rapidly, but still assumed he was overworked. Naomi wasn't informed. She only heard from Tobias Green, Ethan's assistant, the only person in the company who knew of her existence. Tobias handed her an envelope with the words, "Naomi, open, only if I'm no longer here." She didn't open it immediately. She went to the hospital. At first, the guards didn't let her in. She wasn't on the visitor list. She had no title, no official place, nothing except a name Ethan had once whispered in the dark. But Tobias stepped in. And Naomi, for the first time in her life, stepped into the grand lobby of the Whitmore family. All eyes turned to her. No one knew who she was. She didn't explain. She asked ICU, "Where's Ethan Whitmore?" 3 days later, Ethan took his final breath, and the story circled back to where it began, where Naomi whispered, "I'm here like I promised." And in that moment, Naomi knew Ethan's promise was no longer spoken aloud. It was in the letter, in the sealed will. No one could stop in the boardroom where the truth would soon be flipped open like a card. She returned to her Brooklyn apartment the afternoon Ethan passed. The late autumn sunlight streamed through the curtain, painting gold across the cracked wall Ethan had once left half-painted. The room was silent. Aria was napping. Naomi sat at the table, hands trembling, as she opened Ethan's final letter, his last chance to say everything that life had never let him. His voice came to her through every line. "Naomi, I don't know if I even deserve for you to be reading this. But if you are, it means I didn't get to say goodbye correctly. Again. I love you. I've loved you since you first looked at me without admiration. Loved the nights we talked about things that never made the financial reports. I loved how you didn't ask to enter my life. You just walked in like I had always belonged to you. I'm sorry for keeping our love in the dark so long, for letting my cowardice make you and Aria live in the margins of my life. I know that was wrong, and I've tried to fix it. The new will is signed. All my personal assets, properties, and private trust are for you and our daughter. But I know it's not the money you need. You need acknowledgement. And Aria deserves the place she was born to have, not because you're my wife, but because she is my blood. If you decide to step into the light, Naomi, I hope you don't do it out of revenge, but to claim what should have been hers from the start. Be strong, like you always have been, and if possible, forgive the man who loved you in the worst way, but loved you with all his heart. Goodbye, Ethan." Naomi folded the letter. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She closed her eyes, letting silence stretch like she was listening to Ethan's voice one last time. Then she stood, took out the copy of the will Tobias had given her, took a picture, and sent it to the email address of Robert Sinclair, the Whitmore family's chief legal counsel. This is the same man who had denied her 3 times for not being in the system. She attached a brief note. "I am Naomi Carter, the legal wife of Ethan Whitmore and mother of Aria Whitmore Carter. We will be present at the reading of the will this coming Monday. Please prepare 2 seats." No begging tone, no exclamation marks, no added emotion. Just tell the truth, cold, direct, and unignorable. 3 days later, the nation learned of Ethan Whitmore's passing. The media overflowed with praise. He was a genius investor, a visionary strategist, and a man dedicated solely to his career. No mention of Naomi, no mention of Aria, until Monday morning. At the Whitmore and Sinclair office, where the will was to be read, the entire Whitmore family was present. Brandon, Margaret, Diana, Lucas, even niece Isabella, all in elegant black eyes, cold postures, regal. The door opened. Naomi entered, holding Aria's hand. The girl wore a light blue dress, her curls bouncing, her eyes wide with quiet brilliance. No one in the Whitmore family spoke, but the air changed like a storm had just been released into the room. Naomi didn't greet anyone. She didn't need to. She walked straight to the back row, pulled out 2 chairs, and sat Aria beside her. She placed her hand over her daughter's, gently squeezing. Attorney Robert looked at Naomi, then gave a solemn nod. "Before we begin, I have an announcement regarding an update to the will made 3 weeks before Mr. Ethan Whitmore's passing." Every eye turned. Brandon frowned. Margaret squinted. Diana gasped. Robert opened his briefcase and pulled out a sealed document. On the front it read, "To be read in the presence of Naomi Carter and Aria Whitmore Carter." There was nothing left to deny, nothing left to hide. Naomi sat still, eyes locked on the head of the table, calm. Not as a woman demanding a share, but as a wife reclaiming honor for herself and the child who had never been appropriately named. The main boardroom of Whitmore Holdings resembled a private courtroom, with oak-paneled walls, warm yellow lighting from the high ceiling, and a massive U-shaped table, so long that only those with a voice sat at the center. Naomi didn't sit at the center. She chose a seat by the wall just behind Arya, just as she had stood quietly and without a name behind Ethan for years. But this time, no one could ignore her presence. Robert Sinclair, Ethan's former personal attorney, a man more familiar than anyone with the tangled clauses and fine print of Whitmore's legacy, opened his notes. According to the final wishes of Mr. Ethan Whitmore, all private assets totaling $73 million will be transferred into a trust for Mrs. Naomi Carter, his lawful wife, and Ms. Arya Whitmore Carter, his biological daughter, born on February 17th. The room wavered. Brandon, always assuming himself the rightful heir, shot up. This is absurd. Ethan was never married. We refuse to recognize a will written when he was ill and not of sound mind. Naomi remained seated. Unshaken, Robert continued calmly. Before his passing, Mr. Ethan recorded a video verifying his mental state during the signing of the will. We also have a medical evaluation by Dr. Mitchell Graves, an independent psychologist, and official footage from the notarization process. Margaret, icier than ever, turned to Naomi. "You do know how to make an entrance, right?" Naomi looked up, her eyes dry. "I didn't choose the timing. I just couldn't let my daughter grow up without knowing her father tried to protect her, even if only in his final breath." Diana leaned toward Margaret, whispering. Lucas, the quiet one, studied Naomi with a strange look, as though confronting a variable he had never been taught in business school. Arya leaned over and whispered, "Mom, why are they looking at me like that?" Naomi bent down, touching her cheek gently. "Because you're the most beautiful thing your father left behind. And the truth always unsettles people at first. But it doesn't disappear just because they don't like it." The meeting dragged on for 3 hours. The Whitmore family insisted on delaying execution of the will for further verification. But Robert Sinclair, now standing on the side of Ethan, and the truth stated firmly. There is no clause subject to legal dispute. The court will affirm Naomi's status as a lawful spouse and Arya's right as heir should anyone attempt to delay. I am prepared to present all evidence publicly. That statement slammed shut the last door to any denial. Naomi stood up. She bowed to no one. She took Arya's hand and walked out calm as though she had nothing to prove. At the door, Brandon spoke not with anger this time, but with the weariness of a man quietly defeated. "Ethan once told me he didn't dare to stand up to Mother." Naomi turned back and said only one thing, "And I didn't need courage to love him, only the truth." She pushed open the door. Noon sunlight flooded over mother and daughter. No one followed. No one held them back. But from that moment, Naomi had stepped out of the shadows, not needing permission, invitation, or acceptance. She stepped out for the child born without a father's name, and for the man who, though too late, left the door open for the truth to have a way through. The Brooklyn apartment, once the silent sanctuary of Naomi and Ethan, had returned to its original state, just the two of them. However, unlike in the past, Naomi no longer had to avoid people's stares and no longer needed to hide Ethan's photos when guests came over. Now she hung a picture of him right in the center of the living room, where morning light would hit it first, daily. It was the photo he'd secretly taken during Arya's first steps, Naomi laughing, unaware she was being loved in the most unspoken way. Naomi sat on the floor beside an old paint can and roller. She was repainting the stained wall Ethan had promised to finish when he had time. But time waits for no one, and this time she wasn't waiting anymore. Arya was drawing beside her, occasionally looking up. "Mum, can I draw Daddy flying in the sky?" Naomi smiled and nodded. "As long as you remember. He's still watching you from up there." News about Naomi Carter and Arya Whitmore. Carter spread across national headlines, not with scandal, but recognition. An article in New York Weekly opened with "The woman from the shadows, now stepping into the light, with the dignity she reclaimed not through complaints, but with evidence and grace." Forbes posed a question: could Ethan Whitmore's youngest daughter become the only successor to inherit not just the intellect of an empire, but the soul of a heart once hidden. Naomi didn't speak to the press. She didn't answer the reporters camped outside the building. She answered one person, Aria. One Saturday afternoon, the little girl asked Mum, "Was I ever a secret?" Naomi paused. The question was light, but it cut deep into the silent years. She pulled her daughter close, whispered, "You were never a secret. You were a miracle I kept for myself, not out of shame, but because I feared the world wouldn't be kind enough to treat you as you deserve." And now Naomi looked into those eyes so much like Ethan's. It hurt now the whole world knows miracles are real. And I'm proud that you were born from love, not the kind that demands to be seen, but the kind that was always real. The small house in Brooklyn slowly transformed. Naomi turned the spare bedroom into a library filled with Ethan's letters books he once gifted her and the first family photo they ever took in the park. No need for mansions, no press conferences, no funeral with 100 guests. Just a home filled with Aria's laughter, Naomi's peaceful smile, and the freshly painted wall done by her hands in the color Ethan once chose. One winter morning, as snow fell softly outside the Brooklyn apartment window, Naomi stood in front of the mirror, wearing perhaps the dress Ethan had once chosen for her on a special occasion for the first time in years. Her makeup was subtle now. Her hair was neatly tied, and her eyes, though still carrying traces of sorrow, were deep and resolute. She was preparing to attend her first public event, not as the billionaire's hidden wife, but as Naomi Carter, co-founder of the Aria Future Foundation. The idea was born from Ethan's letters. In one of them, he had written, "If I don't live long enough to teach Aria how to live, teach her how to choose what to live for. Show her that even if the world once turned its back on her, she still has the right to walk into it as someone who creates change." It took Naomi nearly 3 months to finalize the legal documents, raise funds, and build a team. But when everything was in place, she named it the Aria Future Foundation, a place offering scholarships, psychological counseling, and legal aid for children who had been discriminated against, hidden, or born outside the social legitimacy of their families. Naomi didn't give a long speech on the foundation's opening day. She told a story about a little girl born with her mother's last name, whose father no one knew, whose existence wasn't acknowledged in any register of a wealthy bloodline. Then she looked straight into the television camera. Today, Aria sits in the front row, called by her actual name, carrying her rightful last name, and an entire future standing behind her. Not because we begged for pity, but because we stepped into the light with truth and didn't back down. Naomi was invited to speak at universities' empowerment summits and social justice organizations in the following months. But she declined most of them. She chose to stay in Brooklyn, driving Aria to school, cooking dinner herself, and reading her a page each night from Daddy's journal, a notebook Ethan had filled with his thoughts when he realized his time was short. The last page of the journal read, "If my daughter ever asks, 'Where's Daddy?' tell her I'm always near whenever the two of you are brave enough to do what's right, even if no one stands with you." Naomi closed the journal. Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't falter. She began to write, not to lament, but to recount. Not for herself, but for the women who were once made to stand outside the lives of the men they loved. For the children who grew up quietly invisible. For the hearts that never dared say, "I belong here." When asked by a magazine, "Do you regret staying silent for so long?" Naomi answered, "No, because I wasn't silent. I was waiting. And when I finally spoke, no one could interrupt me anymore." On the apartment window, Aria taped a handwritten note that read, "This is our real home. Mommy's name is on the mailbox now." The house was still the same, but the people inside it were not. No longer shrinking, no longer bowing their heads. No longer asking, "Do I deserve to be here?" Naomi no longer needed Ethan to walk her onto a stage. She walked by herself. Because true love doesn't need the other person to remain alive to continue inspiring. It only needs the one who remains to be brave enough to finish what was left undone. The annual Redefining 21st Century Leadership Summit was held in Geneva, gathering more than 300 founders, CEOs, activists, and scholars worldwide. This year, there was one name on the speaker list that made the entire hall murmur as it appeared: Naomi Carter. Not a university professor, not a celebrity, never the head of a global corporation, but the woman who turned a family scandal into social momentum, and a final goodbye into an open door for thousands of children to enter their futures under their real names. The night before her keynote, Naomi stood alone on her hotel's rooftop terrace, gazing up at Geneva's star-lit sky. Snow fell gently. The city lights glimmered like stars over the surface of Lake Léman. She thought of Ethan. The last night before he passed, he had asked her, if you could stand at the highest place and say one sentence to the world, what would it be? She'd only smiled at the time because she wasn't ready. But now, she was. The next morning, Naomi walked onto the stage. No background music, no dazzling lights, just a single white slide with one sentence: "Legacy begins where silence ends." She began calm but unwavering. "I don't have an MBA from Harvard. I wasn't born into a family of financiers, and I don't carry the name of any empire. I carry one thing. The belief is that every child, regardless of how they were born, has the right to be seen, called by their proper name, and given the chance to write their own story." She spoke of Aria, of Ethan, of the old wall in their apartment. For the first time, her daughter asked Mummy, "Why am I not in any of the photos at Dad's house?" And she had answered, "That's okay. You'll build a new house where every child has a place on the wall." The room was silent. Naomi looked out, then closed with, "If you had asked me years ago, 'Who are you?' I would have hesitated. But today, if you ask Naomi Carter, 'What do you stand for?' I can say I stand for recognition without permission. I stand for the women who were once hidden, the children once forgotten, and the loves once denied, but still strong enough to survive and shine. And if Ethan Whitmore were alive today, he wouldn't be sitting in this audience. He'd be standing beside me, holding my hand, and proudly calling me his wife." As Naomi stepped down from the stage, the entire hall rose. Not because she was famous, but because the silence she had just shattered echoed like thunder in a time of empty words. In Naomi's hand was the event card from the organizers. On it a line read, "Thank you for reminding the world that some of the most powerful legacies don't come from inheritance, but from integrity." That night back at the hotel, Aria was already asleep. Naomi lay down beside her, looked at that peaceful face and whispered, as if Ethan could still hear her, "See, love. We didn't need a castle, just being called by our real name. It was enough to make a life meaningful." She closed her eyes, and for the first time in nearly a year, she dreamed of Ethan, not walking away like in all the dreams before, but turning around smiling and whispering, "I knew you would." The phone rang while Naomi and Aria were planting saplings in their small backyard garden one spring afternoon. An unknown number. Naomi hesitated. She was about to ignore it, but then something in her gut told her to answer. "Naomi," a man's voice, slow, restrained, careful. "Yes." "Who is this?" "It's Lucas." "Lucas Whitmore." Naomi froze. Lucas, the quiet younger brother of Ethan, had always been the least confrontational one in that family. And yet during the will reading that tore everything open, he was also the only one who didn't mock her. Didn't lash out, maybe. "You don't want to hear this from me," Lucas continued, "but I just read your interview, and I think it's time we started seeing things more truthfully." Naomi didn't know how to respond. Half of her wanted to hang up. The other half was curious why now. 3 days later, Lucas flew to New York. No entourage, no press release. He stood at her doorstep with an old wooden box not filled with assets, but with memories. Naomi opened the door. She didn't invite him in yet. But Aria ran out first. "Uncle Lucas." Lucas knelt, smiling softly. "Do you remember me, sweetheart? I'm not sure. But Mummy has a picture of you in the album." Naomi turned her face away. Ethan had once made sure Aria memorized every uncle and aunt's face, even those who never bothered to call. In the living room, Lucas opened the box. Inside were Ethan's handwritten letters to his siblings. None had ever been sent. On top was one addressed specifically to Lucas. If you're reading this, little brother, I'm gone. I don't expect you to change anyone in the family. I hope you remember this. Naomi didn't break anything. She simply existed. If you can, don't let Arya grow up not knowing she has two sides of a family. I love you, Lucas, and I believe you'll be the first to place your hand on the truth. Naomi read it. She couldn't hold back the tears. Not because of Lucas, but because Ethan once again had tried to leave one final bridge for the daughter he knew would grow up between two worlds. We were wrong, Lucas said softly. Not just for rejecting you, but for being too proud to understand that Ethan's love for you was real and deserved the same recognition as any other love in this family. Naomi looked up. You don't need to speak for anyone else. I'm not waiting for a collective apology. Lucas nodded. I know, but if there's anything I can do to help Arya feel like she doesn't just have one half of the world on her side, I'll do it. A week later, for the first time, Naomi brought Arya to the Whitmore estate in Vermont, where Ethan grew up, and where Naomi had never been welcomed. Not to claim anything, but to give Arya a part of her story that had once been denied. Margaret Brandon and Diana didn't come out to greet them, but Isabella, Diana's daughter, did. The young woman approached, bowed her head slightly. Aunt Naomi, I used to think every story only had one side. But now I know, only the weak fear facing what they don't understand. Naomi smiled. She said nothing. She didn't need more apologies. She only needed the next generation to understand, so they wouldn't repeat old mistakes. That evening, Arya ran barefoot through the fields behind the estate. She looked up at the sky and shouted, Daddy, I made it! And Naomi stood there, watching her daughter in the golden light, thinking, no one can go back and start a new beginning. But anyone can start now and write a different ending. 6 years after Ethan's passing, Brooklyn's summers had grown calm like the storms had never happened. In the now renovated apartment filled with books, paintings, and sunlight, Naomi Carter stood before the mirror, adjusting a simple white shirt before heading out. On the table sat a thick envelope labeled in scribbly blue ink. To Mum, from Arya, but also kinda from Dad, too. Naomi chuckled. Today was her 44th birthday, and it was also the day Arya, the girl who once had to be hidden, would walk across the stage as the top student of her class, delivering a speech titled, My Family is Not a Secret. It's a story. At the ceremony in the parent section, Naomi sat beside Lucas, who now regularly visited with his wife, not out of guilt, but as a genuine part of their lives. Isabella, now a sophomore in sociology, was also there, seated in the front row. As Arya stepped on stage, hair neatly tied, eyes radiant, Naomi clasped her hands, not out of anxiety, but out of pride. Arya spoke clearly. I once asked my mum, am I a secret? Now I know the answer. I'm not a secret. I'm proof. Proof that love can be hidden, but truth cannot be buried forever. The entire hall erupted in applause. But Naomi let her tears fall quietly, because she knew this wasn't a victory moment. This was the final chapter in a journey she had once taken through pain, silence, and resilience. That evening, Naomi and Arya walked home together. They stopped by the old brick wall in the park, the place where Ethan had taken their first family photo. Naomi pulled a new picture from her pocket. Arya, on her 8th grade graduation day. She taped it next to Ethan's old photo. No one removed it. No one objected. Because now the world knew who they were. Do you think Daddy sees this? Arya asked. Naomi smiled. I think he's proud. Not just because you're brilliant, but because you're brave enough to tell the story he never could. A few weeks later, Naomi returned to Vermont alone. Not to fight, not to ask for anything, but to place a small wooden plaque in the garden that Ethan once tended to. It read, This space is dedicated to every love story the world tried to erase, but couldn't. Margaret Brandon and Diana didn't show up, but Lucas stood quietly in the distance. He didn't interrupt, just nodded. A single gesture, speaking for the whole family. Naomi placed her hand on the plaque, whispering, "We didn't win, we didn't break the walls, but we carved out a window and let the light in." That fall, Naomi published her first memoir, She Was Never a Secret. It became a phenomenon, not because of scandalous revelations, but because it told a simple truth. Some love stories don't need to be broadcast. They only need to be respected. On the final page, she wrote, "Ethan, you couldn't walk me through every mile of this road, but I walked it, and I carried you with me in every step." Aria, if one day someone tries to deny you, remember this: you were born from love, and no one gets to take that away from you unless you let them. Naomi Carter never became a CEO. She never remarried. She never gave weekly speeches. She chose quiet. She chose to stay in Brooklyn, where it all began, where Ethan once loved her, with his eyes, and all the words he never got to say. Because some endings don't need to be perfect. They need to be real, warm enough, and honest enough. That is when someone retells them, they'll believe in the kindness the world once tried to hide.